So I'm torn between making a spirited defense of political science or just apologizing up front. I also have the unenviable, or perhaps enviable, depending on whose perspective you have, of having to follow Dr. Foner, which is a very tough act to follow. So I'll do my best. What I'm going to do is just give a quick rundown of a couple themes that come out of the book that Professor Morell mentioned. I'd like to thank Professor Morell for that great introduction, and Professor Burlingame and the Institute for inviting me. You mentioned David Donald. If you've read Donald, you know in Lincoln Reconsidered that Donald once discussed the American political tradition's attempt to get right with Lincoln. His fundamental insight was that as of the 1950s at least, the jury was still out on the question of Lincoln's influence on American politics, or at least American political rhetoric. After his death, many politicians claimed to continue Lincoln's unfinished work. By the time of the New Deal, the claim to the Lincoln inheritance had already become a major component of presidential rhetoric. Given President Obama's recent appeals in recent years, it seems this is still the case. Now, arguably, the rhetorical appeal to Lincoln among American politicians reached its high watermark during the Progressive era, around the time of the centennial of Lincoln's birth. Now, as both an intellectual and a political movement, American progressivism contributed lasting changes to American political development. The progressives generally sought a reinterpretation of the American political order by giving the people more direct power over all levels of government, and in turn by giving government more power to regulate the economy. Now, interestingly, the Progressive era was the first major period in American political development to feature as its central characteristic an explicit and direct criticism of the principles of the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. Rooted in natural rights thinking rendered supposedly obsolete by the progress of history with a capital H, institutions built upon these ideas were seen as incapable of solving the problems of modern industrial America. Now, the progressives understood that the Constitution set up a general government of limited powers, but such things were explicit and persistent obstacles to implementing progressive policies. Key to the progressive project was the attempt to regulate certain sectors of the economy and to redistribute wealth and private property in the name of social and economic justice. But these policies, many progressives argue, would not be enacted as long as the political process was dominated by powerful special interests and as long as the Constitution held anti-democratic obstacles to majority rule. For example, indirect representation, a difficult method of amending the Constitution, federalism, a cumbersome legislative process, etc. So in order to secure social and economic justice, the people needed more direct control over their representatives and their Constitution. And the people would need leadership in the form of a powerful rhetorical president able to articulate the ends and means of a growing national administrative state. The progressives' frequent rhetorical appeals to the Lincoln image became central in this transformation. Now, in the book, I discuss what I call the rhetorical use and abuse of Lincoln in the Progressive era, the New Deal era, and the Great Society era. And I focus on those areas in part because of the lineage of progressivism, but also because I think we could all admit, I think everybody in this room knows, those are considered transformative eras of 20th century political history, and Lincoln figures prominently in that political rhetoric. And I particularly look at presidents. Now, I'll be happy to entertain any questions about modern liberalism or anything sort of post-progressivism in the Q&A session if you like. But what I thought I might do this afternoon, this morning, is just take a brief look at three of the leading architects of the progressive movement. Three thoughtful political actors who regularly invoked Lincoln as a progenitor, a sort of proto-progressive, progenitor of the progressive movement. I'm going to look at three people: leading progressive journalist and founding editor of the New Republic, Herbert Crowley, and Presidents Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. Now, while these three men often rhetorically invoke the Lincoln legacy, eloquently, forcefully, I'm going to argue that they generally rejected Lincoln's defining principles. Now, that's in some ways a controversial claim, and I know that. So I'm already at a disadvantage being a political scientist, and I lob bombs like that. So when I get beat up on, I guess I'd ask for it myself. So what I'm going to try to do, at least begin to do, is as I work through the talk, I'll try to explain why I really do think this is the case and perhaps indicate, if I can, why this matters to us today, and I'm sure during the question and answer session some of those things will come up. So let me begin with Herbert Crowley. We're in a Lincoln crowd. I don't know if we're in a Crowley crowd, but Crowley has sort of become all the rage recently with people like me that study political rhetoric and political theory, in part because of his influence on the progressive movement. And in 1909, notice the year in 1909, right, important year, centennial, he published a famous book called The Promise of American Life. And it was a seminal book. It was considered by many to be the playbook of the progressive movement. Teddy Roosevelt, for example, reviewed the book and read the book and talked about the book as much as possible. And what Crowley was trying to do both in A New Republic and in the book, was to articulate and defend the ends of progressivism. He had to explain its ends before he could try to offer an account of its means. And his account of Lincoln's place in American political history was absolutely crucial to this effort. There's a section in The Promise of American Life that is seen by many as just as a standard sort of hagiography or a eulogy to Lincoln, but I argue that it's much more significant. For Crowley, Lincoln served as an enduring example of leadership, but not just leadership as such, a particular kind of leadership that transcended local and individualistic politics for the sake of what Crowley called a living national idea. Now, if any of you have studied this before, this will be old hat, but I'll say it anyway. Historians are fond of drawing the Hamilton-Jefferson dichotomy, that we were a country in some ways dedicated to Jeffersonian ends through Hamiltonian means. I'm not saying, I don't know, I'm not an historian, if that originated with Crowley, but I do know that Crowley was one of the first journalists to make that explicit in his writing. Now, what Crowley argued was that the Jeffersonian, democratic, he essentially identifies it with democracy, this democratic tradition of local government and individual rights, and the Hamilton nationalist tradition of efficient central government and leadership had always been the most common reference points for our political dialogue. And he contended that the political problem, the number one political problem in American political history, had been the persistent failure for us to synthesize or bring these principles together. We always lean too far in one direction. But traditionally, more often than not, Crowley argued, we embrace the Jeffersonian tradition of individualism, equal rights, and local self-government at the expense of a coherent Hamiltonian national tradition. In a predominantly agrarian economy, Crowley argued, where individual effort was more likely to reward one with prosperity, the common and national interests and the individual interests often really did coincide. But with the rise of modern industry and the increase of economic specialization, the average American, Crowley argued, could no longer achieve political, economic, and spiritual satisfaction merely through the sweat of his own brow. American democracy would now need a model of leadership that would show reformers and average citizens how to transcend local and particular interests in favor of a coherent national, common ideal. Crowley offered Lincoln as the best model for this purpose, suggesting that all of Lincoln's thoughts ultimately, quote, looked in the direction of a higher level of human association. Now, Crowley argued that Lincoln was a truly national man, and it was Lincoln's character, not his deeds or his words, that mattered most to Crowley. He described Lincoln as more than an American. That's Crowley's language, more than an American, asserting that Lincoln was not merely a pioneer Democrat or a man of the people, but also an embodiment of a coming, emerging, evolving national identity. When Lincoln confronted the problem of slavery, he made it plain that a democratic nation could not make local and individual rights an excuse for national irresponsibility. Antebellum political parties had failed to address adequately the slavery crisis because they were far too willing to sacrifice the national common good for mere self-interest. The Democrats believed slavery was merely a matter of local importance, and the Whigs were all too willing to compromise away their principles for immediate political gain. For Crowley, Lincoln provided a model of the qualities necessary for disinterested leadership to transcend self-interested local concerns of the average American in favor of this complete national vision. But I argue that for Crowley to offer Lincoln as a model for progressive reformers, he needed to offer a discussion of Lincoln that actually diverted attention away from Lincoln's own political principles. One clear example of this, I think, comes in Crowley's discussion of human nature. Crowley believed that the average American's hope for social betterment could only be realized through a stronger, more focused, more, as he would say, efficient national government. Such a government, Crowley claimed, quote, would not be dedicated either to liberty or to equality in their abstract expressions, but to liberty and equality insofar as they made for human brotherhood, end quote. Crowley posited that human nature could be shaped in such a way that individuals might routinely sacrifice self-interest for the sake of the common good. In contradistinction, say, to the Federalist Papers, which thought that men were capable of self-government, but it carefully circumscribed the scope of popular government due to the permanent inclination to factiousness within man's nature. Contrary to that, Crowley made a more, arguably, I think, utopian assumption about the perfectibility of human nature. He thus had a faith that human government could be entrusted with the achievement of substantive, real, material equality, as opposed to securing what Crowley would say was a merely formal or abstract quality of rights. According to Crowley, democracy must stand or fall on a platform of possible human perfectibility. His pursuit of progressive reform and human brotherhood as the end of American democracy simply assumed, indeed it must assume, I argue, an infinitely malleable human nature that can be improved through the social planning of administrative experts. And this is Crowley's language. Now, Crowley does admit that perhaps in reality the extent to which human nature can be modified, he says, might be extremely small. But he says, nevertheless, part of the promise of American life, the hope for American democracy, is in fact that that's not true, that human nature can be changed. And I'm a political theorist by training in this. If you read Thomas Hobbes, you see something very similar at the end of Leviathan, where he compares his book to Plato to say, well, Plato's Republic, perhaps it was only an imaginary city, can't be put into practice, but yet we have to have faith. He says the same is true of my work. When you read Crowley, you see something like that. A sort of cynicism, but on the other hand, an insistence that progress really does assume and must require a certain faith in human nature. Now, I argue in the book that despite Crowley's attempt to incorporate Lincoln into this progressive vision of man, Lincoln actually held a very different understanding of human nature, at least as we can tell from his speeches in the 1850s, and I don't see anything that contradicts this understanding in the 1860s. It's commonly said that Lincoln's political rhetoric goes through three phases: a kind of Whiggish customary history in the 1830s and 1840s into a natural right kind of rhetoric when he's squarely dealing with the slavery expansion problem in the 1850s, and then a kind of sacred history or sacred rhetoric, providential rhetoric that comes out late in the war, especially in the second inaugural address. But I argue elsewhere, I don't know that by picking out the natural right argument that somehow contradicts the other kinds of rhetoric. In fact, I think they're mutually reinforcing. Now, when you look at Lincoln's rhetoric, what you see is he had this different understanding of human nature, something we don't see in Crowley, and it's perhaps best expressed in his 1864 response to Serenade. Reflecting upon the difficulty of holding elections during the war, Lincoln suggested the following: the strife of the election is but human nature practically applied to the facts of the case. What has occurred in this case must ever occur in similar cases. Human nature will not change. In any future great national trial compared with men of this, we shall have as weak and as strong, as silly and as wise, as bad and good. In Lincoln's thought, and I've spent some time with this, I haven't seen anything yet to dissuade me of this. In Lincoln's thought, there's no overcoming man's nature to advance to what Crowley called new heights of civic association. There's no assumption that history will culminate in the perfection of human nature through social planning. In short, the enduring problems of political life are rooted in our enduring and necessarily imperfect human nature. And like the American founders, Lincoln understood that limited constitutional government is frankly structured in light of this observation. For Crowley, however, and he says this explicitly, Lincoln exemplified the promise of American life through his, quote, general outlook and behavior, whatever his theories were. That is to say, whatever Lincoln might have identified as his own political principles and reasoning is ultimately of no real consequence for Crowley's argument. Ultimately, in light of the progress of history, Crowley effectually claimed to understand Lincoln better than Lincoln understood himself, and sought to appropriate the Lincoln image while rejecting Lincoln's principles. Now, this rejection of Lincoln's principles is also evident in Crowley's discussion of natural rights. Despite his appeal to Lincoln's image, Crowley explicitly turned away from the natural rights principles that seemed to serve as the foundation of Lincoln's defense of limited government. Crowley called unambiguously for nothing less than what he called a new Declaration of Independence, a refounding of our fundamental moral and political ends. And this is Crowley. Belief in the principle of equal rights does not bind, heal, and unify public opinion. Its effect rather is confusing, distracting, and at worst, disintegrating. Yet Lincoln, Crowley's ideal statesman, claimed the opposite view. Responding to the Southern slave interest denial, the principles of the Declaration, Lincoln famously suggested, which I know most of you know this passage, public opinion on any subject always has a central idea from which all its minor thoughts radiate. That central idea in our political tradition at the beginning was, and until recently has continued to be, the equality of men. For Lincoln, the self-evident truth that all men are equally endowed with natural and inalienable rights is the electric cord that links the hearts of patriotic and liberty-loving men together. Very different than Crowley's statement of equality being a disintegrating principle that will only tear America apart. For Crowley, if the purpose of American government is merely to secure our equal natural rights, then, according to Crowley, democracy becomes an invitation to local, factional, and individual ambitions and purposes. According to Crowley, quote, "Of all perverted conceptions of democracy, one of the most perverted and dangerous is that which identifies it exclusively with a system of natural rights. Such a conception of democracy is in its effect inevitably revolutionary and merely loosens the social and national bond." End quote. Public opinion must be redirected toward a new understanding of democracy, based not upon the idea of securing natural rights, but rather upon the idea that real, live, genuine democracy must necessarily be dedicated to securing human brotherhood on earth. Crowley's effort to seize Lincoln is frustrated by the fact that Lincoln's moral and political reasoning is fundamentally rooted in the very natural right principles that Crowley himself unambiguously rejects. For Crowley to offer up Lincoln as a model for contemporary progressive reform, he had to recast Lincoln's example in terms of a progressive unfolding of American history and abandon the very principles beneath Lincoln's own understanding of free government. Now, we see something like this in Theodore Roosevelt. Crowley was very influential, of course, on Roosevelt, as historians know, and after reading The Promise of American Life, Roosevelt he talks about this in the autobiography, that he became convinced that the founder's political science had become obsolete in light of changing historical and economic circumstances. The progress of history had led to the necessity of a stronger, more efficient national government, unhampered by institutional mechanisms like federalism or separation of powers. And he makes powerful arguments. He says, in modern industrial America, where men were increasingly tied not to the land but to the factory, equality of opportunity could not be secured without an increase in the role of national government and providing that security through social and economic legislation, especially aimed at reining in powerful and exploitive special interests. Now, Roosevelt routinely sought to connect this vision, his vision of what he called equality of opportunity, with Lincoln's expression of equal natural rights. In his famous 1913 address, The Heirs of Abraham Lincoln, where, by the way, this is a famous address, and if you haven't read it, you should, because that might encapsulate in many ways a nice brief look at the progressive claim to Lincoln. Roosevelt argues that the progressives and the progressives alone in 1913 are the spiritual and political heirs of Abraham Lincoln, and it's a powerful speech. If you haven't read it, you should take a look at it. Now, he explained in this speech how Lincoln could be a source for this vision of equality. He claimed that the purpose of the Progressive Party was none other than Lincoln's purpose: to elevate the condition of men, to lift artificial weights from all shoulders, to clear the paths of laudable pursuit for all, and afford all an unfettered start and a fair chance in the race of life. Now, for Lincoln, those artificial weights were the artificial weights of slavery, literal slavery. They would be lifted by emancipation in the free labor system, but for Roosevelt, government must lift the artificial weights as they existed in his day in the form of wage slavery, practiced by modern industry. Yet Roosevelt's famed New Nationalist speech, I think, illustrates how far Roosevelt actually departed from Lincoln's principles. Here I quote Roosevelt: "We grudge no man a fortune in civil life if it's honorably obtained and well used. It is not enough even that it should have been gained without doing damage to the community. We should permit it to be gained only so long as the gaining represents benefit to the community. This, I know, implies a policy of a far more active governmental interference with social and economic conditions in this country than we have yet had. But I think we've got to face the fact that such an increase in governmental control is now necessary." End quote. Now, according to Roosevelt, he follows this up by arguing that the central condition of progress is to, quote, "take from some one man or class of men the right to enjoy power or wealth or position or immunity which has not been earned by service to his or their fellows, and redistribute these goods to men who have earned more than they possess." For Roosevelt, government must determine the acceptable use of property and must respect property rights if and only if it's deemed socially useful to do so. When Roosevelt talks about abolishing special privilege from American life, it turns out that property can be listed among those special privileges. Now, I'm stating this kind of strongly, but I want to see if we can get some questions. Now, Roosevelt's effort to claim the Lincoln inheritance departs again from Lincoln's principles. For Lincoln, the principles of the Declaration suggest that all human beings are equally endowed with natural and inalienable rights. Now, to whatever extent one man is superior to another in accidental characteristics or talents, he may indeed fare better and secure his advantage in the world, but no one can claim a right by nature to rule over another without that other's consent. In everyday practice, this equality seems to mean that a man should be able to eat the bread that he has earned. Lincoln's understanding of natural equality is central to his defense of free labor, and that the origin of private property consists in the natural right that each human being has to his body, to the labor of that body, and to the fruits of that labor. Far from implying the redistributionism Roosevelt advocated in the New Nationalism, Lincoln's pursuit of equality suggested justice of an equality of rights, but not an equality of rewards. For Lincoln, free labor ensures that all have an equal right to pursue happiness under the rule of law, while understanding that unequal rewards will necessarily result. Roosevelt obscured the distinction between equality of rights and equality of rewards that seemed so fundamental to Lincoln's understanding of equality. And in turn, Roosevelt denied the very foundation of Lincoln's views on the superiority of free labor over slavery. Now, Roosevelt also routinely invoked Lincoln's authority in defense of progressive proposals for elements of direct democracy. He frequently appealed to Lincoln as a pure Democrat who would have supported increased legislation for social and industrial justice on the grounds that the people are, in fact, the rightful masters of their Constitution. If we're really going to secure equality of opportunity, the people have to be given a certain means to be able to hold their representatives accountable and in check. He argued that, like Lincoln, the progressives believed in the right of the people to control public servants, and that Lincoln had argued against the Confederacy because they argued that large control by the people in government is a source of, quote, all political evil. According to Roosevelt, such sentiments apply without a change of word to the current progressive position. Now, Roosevelt often referred to Lincoln's December 1861 annual message to Congress, and Lincoln here did indeed suggest that the Confederate insurrection was largely, if not exclusively, a war upon the first principle of popular government, that is, the rights of the people. But absolutely nothing in this address, nor I think in the whole of Lincoln's remarks, suggests that Lincoln's support for the sovereignty of the people envisioned the initiative referendum or the right of the people to recall public officials. Lincoln consistently spoke of elections and the results of elections. And he understood the right of the people to control their public servants to consist in the right to exercise their voice through established, constitutionally structured modes of consent. Now, Roosevelt went further by arguing that Lincolnian principles required support for the recall of judicial decisions, that is, recalling court decisions by popular referendum. And this was a response to what Roosevelt saw as, especially state courts, striking down legislatures trying to address issues of socio-industrial justice, and courts just striking down the will of the people. Shouldn't the people have some kind of measured response to that? Now, in 1912 and 1913, he often reminded his audiences that Lincoln had once suggested in an 1859 speech at Cincinnati that the people of these United States are the rightful masters both of Congresses and courts, not to overthrow the Constitution, but to overthrow the men who pervert the Constitution. According to Roosevelt, Lincoln's position on Dred Scott is identical to the progressive position on the recall of judicial decisions. But again, we have to consider Lincoln's arguments in their fuller context. At Cincinnati, Lincoln urged his audience to resist slavery extension by what he called employing instrumentalities. He tells us what he means by that. We must hold conventions, adopt platforms, nominate candidates, and carry elections. Roosevelt obscured, in other words, the fact that Lincoln sought to address the slavery problem in Dred Scott through established constitutional and political means, meaning elect Republicans to office, demand new policy, change the makeup of the court, and get the court to overrule itself. Roosevelt would also have us forget that emancipation, in Lincoln's view, would always require, ultimately, constitutional amendment. For Roosevelt, judicial recall was arguably just an easier way of amending the Constitution. Now, Roosevelt often assumed, and said so in writing in several places, that anything that was designed in order to frustrate the problem of majority faction or the potentiality of majority faction had become hopelessly quaint. Citing Lord Bryce, he said the problem of majority tyranny has disappeared, if it ever existed, has disappeared from American soil in the 20th century. If that's true, then you really would have a hard time making an objective argument in favor of a difficult amendment process or representation or a great many other things. But Roosevelt frequently made that argument. Now, the founders' political science was based upon an idea that while multiplicity of interests would help control the effects of faction, the problem of faction as such could not be driven out of political life. Interest cannot be driven out of political life, the founders argued, unlike Roosevelt. For the causes of self-interest are sown in the nature of man. Likewise, although Lincoln certainly believed that self-interest could not serve as a sole standard of right action, as he suggested in his Peoria address, he understood that our natural selfishness and our love of justice stand in, quote, eternal antagonism. Thus, institutional arrangements designed to temper and moderate the demands of factious majorities, or at least potentially factious majorities, could not be transcended by economic or historical progress. Now, Wilson. I'll be a little bit more brief with Wilson, hopefully. In Wilson's speeches and writings, we find an appeal to Lincoln similar to that of Crowley and Roosevelt. Now, Wilson, as an academic, was overtly and very self-consciously inspired by Hegel's philosophy of history, and he wanted to help bring forth the modern, rational, bureaucratic state in American politics, and this, he thought, required a direct engagement with the principles and institutions of the American founding. Key to his analysis of the Constitution was his critique of what he called the pernicious spirit of checks and balances. I imagine many of you are familiar with his criticism of separation of powers. He thought that they were based, the notion of checks and balances was based upon a Newtonian view of politics, that the founders had mistakenly taken Newtonian views of the universe, applied them to the Constitution, and said, well, there it is, the machine that would go of itself. That the Constitution would run as a series of counterbalance forces and everything would work out okay. If you read the Federalist, you find that view is contradicted on many pages. I'm not sure where Wilson gets this view. In fact, the Federalist states exactly the opposite, that separation of powers only can depend upon experience. It can't be reduced to a theory. But Wilson uses that as his jumping off point then to argue that what has happened is that this Newtonian understanding of the Constitution needs to be replaced with what he calls a Darwinian understanding, which gets a little confusing. I had a student just recently say, I'm trying to understand Wilson. He says, is it something like this? The founders believed in Newton, so they made checks and balances, but since we came from monkeys, we should believe in leadership, or something like that. And I look at him and I think, and I'm going, maybe that's right. You know, it was one of those things where I had no idea how to respond to that statement, but it made me laugh anyway. So it is using the Newtonian, Darwinian, they're metaphors, right, applying them to social problems. So what Wilson claimed to do then was to try to find a way to counter that by injecting what he called leadership into the Constitution, which he thought the Constitution, when read in this spirit, this Newtonian spirit, frustrated real leadership. And he says, and you guess where I'm going with this, there are antecedents. Even though we need a new leader for a new age, there are historical antecedents, individual examples to which we can point to understand this leadership, and you can probably guess who number one is. That's why we're all here. Right? Lincoln, he says, was a man of the people, and not merely in the sense that he came from humble ranks. Rather, he was the Hegelian-style leader of the people, someone who could see horizons which the people couldn't see. He could speak for the people, not merely from them. He could re-articulate public opinion back to the people because the people don't fully understand it yet. He's a step out ahead in the progress of history. And he's above all a rhetorician of the highest rank, using the parable, the metaphor, and being able to express very high ideas in a way that the people can readily understand. Now, we know, at least most of us in political science know about Wilson's early attempt to sort of replace the Constitution with cabinet government. I'm not going to get into that. This is a later stage of his theory. And when he looked at the presidency, he's thought, okay, here's the vehicle for leadership. Public rhetoric, public visibility, close relationship with the people. And he knew, self-consciously, he said that this will replace the founders' understanding of the presidency. The founders had assumed that while executive authority was derived from the sovereignty of the people, in civil society that authority was defined and structured and limited by the people's constitution. But such limitations for Wilson were on the wrong side of history. Insofar as human nature can evolve over time, as Wilson's historicism posits, such institutions that assume a necessarily imperfect human nature simply stand in the way of progress. For Wilson, the power of the executive comes not from the Constitution, but from a mandate continually renewed and conferred by the people themselves directly. And the president becomes the guiding example in our political history of a potential interpreter leader, and Lincoln becomes the particular example of this kind of leader. Now, we see some of this, and everyone in here in this room is familiar with this. The Rossiter, Randall, Dietz version of the dictator thesis, as Herman Bell says, is an oxymoron, presidential dictator. But one thing Bell says famously is that it makes Lincoln a prototype of 20th century presidential rhetorical government. Now, whether and how the Lincoln presidency actually contributes to this, of course, as all of you know, is a matter of debate. And I'll just point to, in the interest of time, I'll just point to one concern. We know in the message to Congress in special session that Lincoln didn't only base there his arguments, his actions regarding Sumter on a public necessity under the Constitution. He also claimed a popular demand might have necessitated such actions that were of dubious constitutionality. And I say that to be fair because I don't know where everybody stands here. I'll just say that. We could debate these things. Many people say that sounds a lot like Lockean prerogative that you might find in John Locke's second treatise, but in order to invoke Lockean prerogative, he would have to imply, or at least make the argument, that the president could appeal outside the Constitution and directly to the people as such, as the judge of the scope of executive power. Many people have argued, many of them among them a certain brand of traditionalist conservative, have argued that leaves open the door to the Wilsonian or the FDR presidency, the modern presidency, as a rhetorical presidency or a plebiscitary presidency. But as Benjamin Kleinerman, I don't know if anyone's read Kleinerman's work, but Kleinerman and others have argued that popular demand argument is just simply an anomaly in Lincoln's thought. It shows up once in the special message, and he backs away. And from then on out, what you see is an argument of constitutional necessity based on the president's unique duty to protect, preserve, and defend the Constitution of the United States. If you have questions about that, we can talk about that later. I'll say one more thing about Wilson. There's still a more fundamental difference between Wilson and Lincoln, and I think you see this in Wilson's discussion of the Declaration of Independence. Wilson made a famous argument that the Declaration, imagine if your professor in school told you this, if you really want to understand the Declaration of Independence, ignore its first two paragraphs. Wilson says this in writing, ignore its first two paragraphs. The reason he made that argument was that the first two paragraphs are all about this strange natural rights language that we clearly know today has been transcended. This isn't true. History's proven this wrong. So it becomes a document merely about just defining liberty, in the particular, not in the general as you would in an abstract natural rights sort of way. So what he argues is each generation is able to redefine liberty as they will. That's what the Declaration means. Each generation gets to define liberty, and liberty becomes the result of a deal struck between the people and the government. It's no longer a discussion of pre-political rights that you as human beings have, whether government wants you to or not. Therefore, if government can give you your rights, Wilson's up front, government can also take them away because they're merely the result of convention. Now, obviously, this is very different than Lincoln. Lincoln once declared all honor to Jefferson, the man who, in the concrete pressure of a struggle for national independence by a single people, had the coolness, forecast, and capacity to introduce into a merely revolutionary document an abstract truth applicable to all men in all times. Wilson, on the other hand, attempted to divorce Lincoln from the idea of abstract truth altogether, having once strangely praised Lincoln as a man without any theories at all who did not seek to tie you up in the meshes of theory. Wilson famously tried to turn Lincoln into a version of Edmund Burke. It's debatable whether you could ascribe that to Burke as well, but you can look it up, as they say. Now, for Wilson, the American tradition ought not to be understood in terms of this doctrinaire understanding of abstract natural rights, but rather as an intensely organic, intensely practical tradition that can evolve and adapt to ever-changing circumstances. But as his handling of slavery and emancipation shows, Lincoln clearly understood there's always going to be a disjunction between theory and practice. Wilson and Lincoln both are rightly concerned about the dangers of abstract thinking or doctrinairism, but it's simply wrong to suggest that Lincoln didn't engage in abstract thinking. Now, I'll just say a few general words here and to conclude, because I'm just about over time here. What Wilson's reading of the Declaration does, I argue, is that it rips the theoretical ground from beneath the very notion of limited government, and with it any enduring objective defense of limited government. And as Lincoln's arguments regarding the slavery issue repeatedly indicate, the natural rights principles of the Declaration place trans-historical limits of what men might consent to, and should continually guide our understanding of liberty and self-government. In the end, Wilson's take on the Declaration actually falls prey to the same devastating criticisms Lincoln levied at Douglas in the debates of 1858. Unmitigated rule with no limitations. Popular sovereignty. I'll say it, popular sovereignty, scare quotes. And Lincoln's arguments, it seems to me, are still relevant today. Now, let me just say one last thing, and then we'll have some questions. Just by way of conclusion, I think when you look at Crowley, TR, and Wilson, what you readily find if you engage their writings directly is that the progressive claim to the Lincoln legacy is frustrated. I'm not saying that they don't have some claim. I think Lincoln belongs to many people. But the way in which they try to claim Lincoln is often frustrated by the fact that progressive political thought is fundamentally at odds, in many cases, with Lincoln's own moral and political reasoning. But as I argue in the book, and as I said briefly earlier about Crowley, in many respects it seems to me this is not a problem for progressive thinkers because the historicism one finds in so much progressive political thought can subsume all that comes before it. Simply put, standing confidently at the end of history and exempting ourselves from our own premises that all thought is historically relative, many progressives effectually claim to understand Lincoln, again, better than he understood himself. As you can probably tell, I remain a bit skeptical of that proposition. Oftentimes, I think what you see is when it suits rhetorical purposes, Lincoln can serve as an enduring example of progressive policies and leadership, but yet when Lincoln's own words and deeds are at odds with this vision, Lincoln suddenly becomes a child of his age, merely a child of his age, trapped in a mode of thinking that we know better, or know to be false. But insofar as one questions the historicist's claim to wisdom, insofar as we are at least open to the idea that Lincoln's natural rights principles are really true, then maybe Lincoln might still have something to teach us about liberty and equality in a limited constitutional government. Thanks. I'll be happy to answer questions. I know we're mostly historians, but surely someone wants to beat up on a political scientist. This is like, open season. Come on.
Go ahead, Fred.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to ask you, my name is Fred Martin. I have an e-paper on or an e-scholarship paper on the lost chapter on Korea, and when you compare Lincoln and Roosevelt and Wilson, Lincoln's fundamental principle of equality was overriding. And it seems to me that by comparison, Roosevelt and Wilson were led to be what you might even call racists. And we know, for example, that Teddy Roosevelt's mother was rabidly pro-Confederate, and his uncle, Jimmy Bullock, was the one who got the two privateers out of England that ravaged the thing, and his cousin fired the last shot of the Civil War. And Teddy was want to talk about Uncle Jimmy a good bit. And what I think undermines this comparison with Lincoln to some extent is that against the advice of many senators like Carl Schurz, he went into the Philippines and insisted on making it a colony as opposed to creating democracy. And to do that, he was feared that the Japanese, having mediated the Russo-Japanese War, would also have their eyes on the Philippines. And so he sent his Secretary of State to cut a deal saying, you can have the Korea, which led us into Korea eventually, and then Wilson, when he went to Versailles and said he excluded the Asians, and that's what turned Ho Chi Minh into a communist in part. How do you reconcile this progressive view in a sense with Lincoln's views versus those of Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson?
Well, the short answer is I don't reconcile them. And I'm not saying that to be a smart aleck. I didn't, in my own research, I didn't get into Roosevelt and Wilson's writings, and they're there to be seen on race explicitly. I'm not an expert on it, but I can speak briefly to what I think they do with and about race and equality. They have to do something with the notion of equality. They can't simply draw a direct line from the Gettysburg Address or the speech at Independence Hall and say, okay, we're egalitarians like Lincoln. What they do is they take equality, they remove it largely from the context in which Lincoln spoke about it. I mean, let's be frank. Despite the fact that all of us here would say, well, when we talk about equality, there's some lineage to Lincoln. Lincoln is speaking specifically about free labor and slavery. His statements about equality are almost always in that context, slavery and free labor. The applications, be it on the left or the right, progressive, conservative, whatever, the applications of that equality often, we were having a conversation about this earlier, often reflect the desires and passions of the people who are invoking Lincoln more than Lincoln himself. I think the same thing's true with Roosevelt and with Wilson, and also to an extent with Crowley. The writings on race are certainly there to be seen in Roosevelt. And Roosevelt made no uncertain terms about the fact that what we understood at the dawn of the 20th century was something they didn't understand in the previous century, the superiority of a certain kind of people for democracy, and that they had to train others to become ready for democracy. And he explicitly, in a lecture in Germany, basically called it a world historical movement, and he directly tied it to the teachings of Hegel. Now, what do they do with equality? They shift the focus away from race and slavery, which was explicitly about in Lincoln, to predominantly, I think more than anything else, economic equality. Roosevelt once said, what we need is an economic democracy where men are materially and spiritually fit to be their own masters. And that can't happen without a kind of economic redistribution. You'll find almost always what happens in Crowley, TR, and Roosevelt is equality now is defined in terms of economics rather than racial or some notion of rights to self-government or something like that. That's a short answer, but I hope that it at least responds in some way. Sir.
Yes, this is just a caveat about your use of the term historicism. Do you use it in the quick question first before I ask my real question? Are you using it in the Leo Strauss term of historicism?
Well, as much as I don't want to be called a Straussian in front of a bunch of historians, I'll say yes. But we'll say that's a temporary answer. Okay. Well, and I hope Lucas' moral rises and expatiates further. But I just want to say, historicism is used as a lumping term to disparage all German historians. But Leopold von Ranke, who's really the great German historian, and two of his top students, Theodor Mommsen, the Roman historian, and Jacob Burckhardt, are not Hegelians.
and not all German historians are Hegelians. Most of them are. Treitschke and you can say Thomas Carlyle too. But this racism does not automatically equate with it. And this is Leo Strauss has done damage by, what's the word? By smearing everybody with the sin of German idealism and Hegelianism. And yet Strauss himself is a German idealist.
Okay, I appreciate the comment. I'm not going to defend Strauss in terms of his use of the term historicist. I don't know enough about that, but I appreciate the comment, and it's certainly not my intent to smear a whole discipline and a whole tradition by using a word. But you're right. We need to use words precisely, and I appreciate your comment, sir.
All right. Do you believe that progressive era politicians were misguided by Lincoln's policy on slavery, even though he used this as a political tool to fight social and economic corruption rather than political corruption? And how would Lincoln face political corruption, such as political machines, in the early 20th century and late 19th century?
Okay. Let me preface that with another Weasley response. I don't get into the what would Lincoln do game very much. Part of the reason I don't get into it is because often we're merely speculating. We can try to guess and look at some things and find light cases and say, well, maybe. But when it comes to something like political corruption, I often wonder if we have to be very, very specific, because what I think happens, especially with Wilson's writing, Wilson's speech for the American Political Science Association, taking on machine politics, it was always argued to be we're taking on corruption. And what you start to see happen over time is that corruption in some ways is associated with partisanship. And if we somehow can break down the notion that we're parties trying to win elections and all talk about the common good, then therefore everything good in the world will follow. Well, you can't get any more partisan than Abraham Lincoln. You can't get any more political than Abraham Lincoln. He spent his whole life, with the exception of just a few years, playing the political game. So I don't know how to respond to that in the sense of what would Lincoln do about the machines. Yeah, again, short answer, but that's the best response I have.
And again, do you think that progressives were misguided by Lincoln's policy in politics?
I don't know. Well, I don't know that I understand that part. Were the progressives misguided by Lincoln's policy to do what?
To enact on social and economic rather than political. Because as Lincoln freed slaves and...
do I think the progressives were misguided in supporting that?
Yes.
Absolutely not. I don't think the progressives were misguided in praising Lincoln's embrace of equality. What I'm arguing is that they are subtly redefining and expanding that notion of equality in a direction that Lincoln himself just didn't discuss. Let me be clear. I'm not a... what's the title, John? Loathing Lincoln. I'm certainly not a Lincoln loather. I'm not one who loathes Lincoln. And I'm not one who loathes the progressives. What I'm trying to do is to look at ideas the way they're expressed in political rhetoric and to try to understand all of these people, try as best I can to understand them as they understood themselves. That might be a stretch, but that's what I'm trying to do.
Jason, it seems to me that the progressives could, in fact, with some justification, cite Lincoln as a precedent when it comes to some things, the rights of labor, for example. You dealt with this somewhat, but maybe you'd like to deal with a little more about courts. And does the Supreme Court serve as the ultimate arbiter?
Yeah.
But on the other hand, one counter-argument against the progressive interpretation of Lincoln is Lincoln's heavy emphasis on property rights and how the progressives undermine that. Would you care to elaborate on those?
Yeah, any of the three, and I don't know if I'll do them in that order. Let me start with courts. Well, and it relates to property rights. Notice in the Lochner era, part of the progressive era of jurisprudence, the idea that property rights had gotten in the way of the rights of legislatures, mostly states, but also the Congress, to address real problems facing the people that put them there in office. This kind of responds to the gentleman's questions earlier. I am somewhat sympathetic to Roosevelt's arguments about the judiciary. But I don't know that I agree with the ultimate solution. When I argued that when Lincoln takes on Dred Scott, what Roosevelt says is that Dred Scott became a dead letter because Lincoln practically recalled the decision. Now, he does that to obscure the difference between actually having a referendum to vote away a Supreme Court decision and just the normal political process. what I became struck by when I started going back and looking at more of Lincoln's speeches and writings on Dred Scott and the courts in general is that he doesn't, obviously, with Roosevelt, neither did FDR, neither did Jefferson, neither did Andrew Jackson, think that the court is the ultimate and final, unquestioned, absolutely no appeal arbiter of the Constitution. In fact, isn't that what Stephen Douglas started begging the question? Says, well, there's no appeal higher than the Supreme Court. And Lincoln says, yes, there is. Right? It's the American people. I think that there is a certain sympathy depending on the questions that are at hand, they might disagree. But the idea that the courts need to be reined in some way, I think is consistent with both the progressives and Lincoln. They might disagree about the means. Also, by the way, I think it's consistent with the founders themselves. I think if you read the Federalist Papers, when you see the discussion of separate and co-equal branches, even Federalist 78 on judicial review, there are certain caveats that are made to show that the court, too, can become arguably oppressive, perhaps tyrannical, we hope not, but at very least illegitimate. So I think in that question, there is some plausibility there, but I still think we have to make some pretty fine distinctions. Property rights, I agree totally with your statement. I think that especially and you see Roosevelt struggle with this, trying to figure out what we mean by property rights. And usually what he does is he wants to use Lincoln and say, we're following in this Lincolnian tradition. But he says we have to redefine property rights in light of current circumstances. So he doesn't want to deny the very notion of private property, but I think, again, in the New Nationalist speech, it shows that private property becomes largely a product of convention. Private property, in many ways, is regulated by majorities without any buffer, any protection whatsoever. That, I think, is very different than Lincoln, and I don't think there's any way around that problem. The other one labor. This is something I need to do a little more work on. Of course, Bort's work and other places I've tried to work on this. I need to do a little more work on it. But what you usually see with Lincoln, the superiority of free labor, obviously, the right to rise, right, which many progressives argued, though, and I'll come back to this, argued that that didn't work anymore. We don't live in that America anymore where you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps. But I think one thing that comes out that's neglected is Lincoln's support of the right to strike, right? I mean, that's something we have to pay real attention to. I think when you look at especially Roosevelt's discussions of union organization, I think, there's a certain plausibility there. You could look at Lincoln on the right to strike. But I think the biggest thing that happens, and this goes back to that discussion of economic equality earlier, one thing that I do know you see, this is consistent in Crowley, it's in Roosevelt, it's in Wilson, it's in FDR. A version of it is in Obama's book, The Audacity of Hope, building on a version of the argument FDR had made, is that Lincoln is always useful until it comes down to the fact that Lincoln lived in pre-industrial America. So the progressive argument, usually because it presents a kind of economic history, think Franklin Roosevelt's famous Commonwealth Club address in 1932. This is a perfect example of that sort of argument, that we started out as an agrarian economy. We eventually came to where we had economic specialization, industrialization. People now can't make their own way without more help from the central government. Certain plausibility there. But what they often have to do with Lincoln then is say, well, Lincoln would have thought this had he been alive. And that's why I often have trouble with that. Right? I mean, I really do have trouble with that. So again, it's a short answer, but that's the best one I have for now. Yeah. Sir. Oh, wait, did I skip somebody on this side? Yeah, ahead. Sir.
I have a question about Lincoln's policy. As we all know, by the mid to late 19th century, immigrants were pouring into the U.S. And I have a question. How did this mass migration to the U.S. of all these immigrants and not non-citizens affect Lincoln's progressive policy on them?
Okay. The historians in the room could probably give a better answer than me, but I do know that there's this famous speech in Chicago, this response to Douglas just before the debates leading up to, where Lincoln, it's a very famous passage where Lincoln essentially tries to define U.S. citizenship in moral terms, or at least theoretical terms. I would argue they're explicitly moral terms, but we could debate that as well, where he essentially argues that being an American has nothing to do with race, gender, ancestry, your lineage, your ethnicity. It has to do with being dedicated to certain propositions, and you can guess what that proposition is, above all others, dedicated to the propositions expressed in the Declaration of Independence. When you look at that, I think it stands, first of all, in stark contrast to something like the Dred Scott decision, But immigration is something that Lincoln understood need not provide a kind of division where we can't all be dedicated to the same kind of principles. It's a more definite citizenship. However, we know that in practical, down-in-the-dirt politics, he resisted the Know-Nothings, right? He didn't like the Know-Nothings. The Know-Nothings, this nativist party, right? But yet he struggled, like all other politicians, especially in a new political party after being in the Whigs with the Republicans, to court and try to figure out where are our biggest strengths. What ethnic groups can we court? What groups can we not court? That's just practical politics.
Thank you.
Good question, by the way. Sir.
Just two very brief questions. On Lincoln's attitude toward Dred Scott, which held that Congress could not abolish slavery in the territories, what do you think of the fact that he signed the legislation in 1862 abolishing slavery in the territories? And second, relates to the very first question about the progressive movement and civil rights. I think, very oversimplification, Jim Crow prevailed in the United States informally and legally from the end of Reconstruction, at least until the civil rights movement in the 60s. And wasn't the progressive movement part and parcel of the Jim Crow era? Was there any element anywhere in the progressives that supported civil rights for African Americans?
Well, again, it's not an area that I'm an expert on. I don't feel terribly confident about talking about race and the progressives, although I do know that it's difficult for me to see, among the major progressive rhetoricians at least, the grounds for the argument for civil rights. Because I tend to agree myself, personally, with Dr. King on this, that the ultimate ground for the argument for civil rights ultimately begins with the argument for natural rights. You could have a progressive, and someone here might know better than I do, find a stray progressive somewhere here and there arguing for civil rights, this, that, and the other, but the question always for me has become, on what grounds? On what grounds? Is it merely just on the grounds that we're going to get enough voters to say we want it? Well, if that's the case, and that's, although it's opposite policies, it's the same reasoning as Douglas's popular sovereignty and subject to the same criticisms that Lincoln made of popular sovereignty. As for legislation abolishing slavery in the territories, this came up in Dr. Froner's talk a bit. You've heard the phrase, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. It's sort of what happens during the war might not have happened before a war. Military necessity creates quite a wrinkle. But the other thing you see, what I think is really interesting, is D.C., right? When you talk about D.C., what's the difference between, I've seen students ask this, what's the real difference between saying that prior to the war Congress had no power, or the Dred Scott decision saying Congress had no power to abolish slavery in the territories? Lincoln said, of course, all the way back to the Northwest Ordinance we claim we had. But yet, you start looking at D.C. D.C. is itself a territory, but a federal district. But then you start thinking about the question of, isn't there a difference, a distinction, a prudential distinction to be drawn between getting rid of slavery in states where it already exists and an adoption, then getting rid of slavery where it exists in states, introducing slavery in states where it exists, and then taking a federal district under federal control and saying we can abolish it. He makes these distinctions all the time, and what happens is there's always different lines of jurisdictional authority, and each time he has to make a particular kind of argument. So again, it's best I can do, I think. Sir?
Well, I'm just thinking, it was the optimism. How did Lincoln and the progressives think of the future? Did they think that eventually society would get better and better and more and more just?
Well, we have time for just the last response. I'll just speak to that. Yeah. One thing, we might as well say something about the word progress. Society getting more moral or better. What you see, I think, in Lincoln and the progressives, they both use the word progress, but I really do think that you're seeing the use of one word that often has two different meanings. I think in the progressives, you really do see the idea that there can be a certain moral progress. I'm not saying they're looking for a perfect utopia wherever, sunshine and rainbows for all of us, but there's a kind of moral progress that comes along with history. Whereas in Lincoln, I think it's much more rooted in a kind of Jeffersonian Enlightenment notion of progress, just in our understanding of the human condition, but that means in many ways understanding our limitations, understanding our failures, and understanding imperfection in politics. And I think when you start to lay Lincoln alongside the progressives, that distinction becomes pretty clear. So I know there's some still people standing. I'm out of time here, but if you want to hang out for a minute, I'd be happy to talk to you. Thank you very much.